next speaker. He's an old friend of the symposium. I've known him for many years, and he's really done so much good work in terms of understanding the link between mental health, shamanism, and yeah, he's just got such an intelligent way of looking at the whole situation. So rather than taking up his time, let's get him on stage. A big hand for Jez Hughes.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you all. So I'm going to be exploring today the link between a phenomenon called shamanism, which I'll explain a little bit more about in a minute in terms of its definition, and mental illness, what we label as mental illness in the modern world. And I'm going to be drawing quite a few links between traditional initiatory sicknesses, which have been called the shamanic sickness, and what we experience as the symptoms of mental illness, and going to be exploring whether those links have a relevance to us in the modern world. But I'm not going to stand here and claim that everyone who has mental illness or is experiencing symptoms of mental illness is a potential shaman, although I will draw some links that there might be potential pathways in their life that is maybe opening up to them through this initiation. So that's one part of the talk. The other part will be really looking at how we view and how our society is set up and what effect that has on our mental health. And Andy alluded to it in his talk just now about the pressure on young people. And yeah, we are facing something of what experts are calling a mental health epidemic or mental illness epidemic at the moment. So these are the main points I'm going to look to explore. The first is a shamanic sickness, initiatory view, and I'll be going into a lot of detail about, like I say, how what we call mental illness and the symptoms of mental illness are really have been going on for tens of thousands of years when we look at ancient cultures, and that they would see them as a very initiatory, a calling to a path of service, a calling to be a shaman. Then we're going to switch completely and look at a Western perspective and particularly the limitations of what they call the biochemical model, which is basically the kind of mainstream view of the last 30 years or so. What are the causes of mental illness, which you probably all heard on about chemical imbalance, but we're going to look very critically at that. And then I'm going to explore psychedelic medicines and the shamanic states of consciousness to treat mental illness. Now, you may have been seeing stuff in the media being picked up a lot about the potential of this great new dawn in terms of psychiatric treatment. Most psychiatric hospitals now have a dedicated, and particularly in London, a psychedelic section, which is extraordinary, really, considering these substances are still illegal and have had a lot of propaganda against them for the last 50 years and the war on drugs. So we're going to look at some of the clinical studies and see how powerful potentially they could be, but also with a slightly critical look, because when you take away the substance from the shamanic ritual that traditionally would surround these medicines as plant medicines or teacher plants, they're called traditionally, what we could actually lose in the modern world when we take away the ritual and the spirit of the plant. So to begin with, what is shamanism? It's becoming a bit trendy nowadays, shamanism. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it was just a very small subculture. Nowadays, you're hearing shamanic this, shamanic that. There's even shamanic cornflakes in America, and that's a true shamanic breakfast cereal. So it's used a bit of a word now to sex things up. Oh yeah, this is shamanic. But what we're doing, and I mean, it's good that it's getting into the mainstream, but there is a potential equally that it could go the way that maybe Western yoga has gone, and it could lose the whole meaning and spirit of it. And a lot of that is because people don't really understand what shamanism is. And I want to just really start with a kind of quite a clear definition. So shamanism is the magical religious practice of going into controlled trance, repetitive trance, to access and commune with what they call the spirit world on behalf of others. Now, there's a few really important points there. Controlled trance. That means the shaman is able to do it at will. It's not, they're not knocked into a trance like as some spirit mediums will suddenly go into a channel or start channeling. Shamans will always do it at will. When they've trained. Now, when I talk about the shamanic initiatory sickness, it's slightly different because they will be spontaneously going into trance, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And the other really important bit is on behalf of others. So a shaman is always accessing different altered states of reality, ecstatic states of reality, shamanic states of consciousness. These are all names that have been used when the shaman goes into a trance, but they're always doing it on behalf of others. So it's not like a mystical tradition where you might meditate in a cave in order to find a kind of unity with God or a sense of oneness. This is what shamans aren't interested in. That might be a byproduct of what they do. They might meet God, they might meet all kinds of different beings in the other world, but they're always doing it in a social setting as well. They're never doing it alone. So they're always doing it on behalf of others in a social setting. Generally for healing, divination, that means seeing deeper into the past, the present, and the potential future. Finding lost things, including souls. One of the big parts of shamanic healing actually involves something called soul loss, which happens in modern terms, we call it disassociation through trauma, and the shaman will go and track these soul parts, which from a shamanic perspective literally leave or get stuck places, and so they'll bring them back. Hunting magic, so i.e. divining where the game will be the next day before they go hunting, so the shaman will go, and I was in the communities, I worked very closely with an indigenous people called the Radical, or in Spanish the Huichol, from north central Mexico, and we were on a pilgrimage just in this year, and they had to hunt the deer the next day, and I witnessed an all-night ceremony where the Murakami, which is the shaman in their language, was tracking where the deer would be, communicating with the deer spirit, and the deer spirit gives them the sacrifice, and then they go out the next day. So there's always a bit of pressure on being a shaman, because obviously you get that wrong once or twice, the community might forgive you. But if you repeatedly get it wrong, the game's going to be there, then the people are going to go hungry and they're going to lose their patience very quickly. So you'd be sacked, basically. So it is quite, there's always a bit of pressure. Paying the community's spiritual debt, corresponding with healing the dead and ancestors, and again controlling the weather. So all of these aspects that shamans are involved with involves the survival of the community. It is about the tribe, and it is about survival. So it's using a magical religious practice in order to enhance the community's ability to survive. Because in a small-scale community where shamanism comes from, which is probably the oldest spiritual practice on earth. People are not sure, but it probably goes about tens of thousands of years. But in these small-scale communities, if one person gets sick, the whole tribe suffers. So it's a life and death situation, and obviously controlling the weather, making sure the crops grow, making sure they can hunt the game. It is always about survival. So the shaman's vocation. Now, there's a long history between shamanism and mental illness. As Ronald Hutton was talking last night, when we study shamanism from the West, it says a lot more often about us and our own preconceptions, and what Andy was talking about this morning as well, our own chosen truths. To begin with, shamans, when the anthropologists went to the different tribes, and they noticed there was this usually one figure who would do all the things that I've just described. But what anthropologists noticed, that they were similar figures across all different indigenous tribes, from Australia to Siberia to North America, and they had a very similar function in the group. We probably, in these lands, there would be druids or magicians, though we don't know that much about them. So at the beginning, they were cut off from the sanctity of God. They were just pagans who worshipped the devil. And then as Western society became a bit more secular, it started saying, actually, they're just mentally ill. And this link between being possessed by the devil and being mentally ill has a long history, as we'll discover. So in the sort of 19th, 20th century, all these anthropologists were kind of, and then you had the Freud's theories of the unconscious, so they got very excited and just were labeling shamans mentally ill. But what they were saying, and often, and this is a point for the talk, that they were practicing mentally ill. So as long as they practiced their healing path, or their medicine, they actually just stayed on the right side of sanity. Although if we look at this, which I love this quote, studying shamanism, we encounter, first of all, entire categories of men and women who either suffer from nervous agitation or are obviously not in their right mind or completely insane. It is a form of religion that was created through the selection of mentally unstable people, which some would argue is still the case today. Otherwise, you'd do something normal, and you'd I don't know, go to the pub every weekend instead of sitting in a sweat lodge or fasting for hours or in nature. So this idea that goes way back, that these shamans are kind of practicing psychotics, they were called, or different, they were labelled all these different things, because as Western intelligentsia or mainstream society went and would see these shamans, they were the other. They were so different. They were horrified by their practices. They were so alien. Equally, how we have treated the mentally ill, as we'll go on to talk about, is a very similar way. They're always seen as the other and locked up or tried to be got rid of in society, because there's something about this energy, I suppose, that conventional society, particularly as it gets more puritanical, which it is at the moment, doesn't like. There's a wildness of spirit. There's a different ways of seeing the world that really mainstream society has always struggled with. So let's look at what the links are between the what we call the symptoms of mental illness and the shamanic crisis, or the initiatory crisis. Now, this is something that has been covered in wide aspects in anthropology. There's papers and there's accounts, first-hand accounts full of these. When the anthropologists would go into Siberia, there's a lot of accounts, and they would discover there's this idea of this shamanic sickness. And that involved basically the potential initiate, often around adolescence, which is again when mental illness symptoms can often come into people's lives in a big way. Suddenly begins to be psychically haunted in their dreams. Either they're having nightmares all the time, or in their waking visions. They're starting seeing things that aren't there. They're starting hearing stuff. These visitations prompts mood swings. There's something very disturbing the initiate finds about this. And this is something I really want to emphasize, because as shamanism is becoming this kind of sexy word, and people want to put it into this kind of, I can be this powerful shaman kind of thing. In traditional cultures, being seen as being touched by the spirits, being too close to the spirit world, is actually seen as quite disturbing. It's not something, I mean, indigenous people think we're mad if we want to be shamans, because there's so much of a burden. You take on the burden of the community, you take on the burden of the sickness of the community. So these visitations prompt mood swings. It's like this idea that I teach a lot of this stuff in the woods, and people always saying, I want to see a spirit, I want to see a spirit. Why can't I see a spirit? Everyone else sees a spirit, I don't. And then we're doing a ceremony in the heart of the woods, and it's pitch black, and then a spirit physically manifests for them and starts manhandling them, and it freaks them out, understandable. And they run this this idea that we have a romanticized idea of the invisible world and the spiritual realities. And I think that in the shamanic indigenous cultures, they're much more pragmatic, and they take in that the spirit world holds everything, dark, light, everything. Good, evil, sickness, health. Everything is seen as coming from the spirit world. So any kind of sickness particularly has been seen as caused from visitation. But even things like bad luck is seen as an illness in shamanic cultures. You having a series of bad luck, they would say, you've lost your power, go see a shaman, they'll bring you back your power. So these visitation prompt mood swings and exhibitions of erratic behavior, often accompanied by physical symptoms such as convulsions. That's how I began. I had a fit when I was 14. I've told this story many times. And then I kind of went on a journey of about 17 years on and off of quite serious mental breakdowns, but I was stubborn. I didn't really trust mainstream medicine. So I kind of went on, it took me on a journey. But I've also got a lot of mental illness running in my family. A sibling with diagnosed schizophrenic, 2 cousins, an uncle. And as I say, I just made a career out of it. I just... get invited places like this. So, because convulsions, repetitive rocking, alongside other physical appearances such as weight loss. Now, weight loss is a classic that affects people going through modern experiences of mental illness. And they withdraw. This is also important. Sleeping for long periods and unable to engage in normal activities. So even in shamanistic cultures that understand that this is a visitation probably from the invisible world, the person is still unable to get on with life. They withdraw into themselves. And this eventually leads to a complete cutting off from society when they often take themselves off voluntary into nature to live similarly as a wild person. But also they might act up and break taboos in society. So sometimes if it's a very conservative culture, they might walk down the street naked, or they might eat bark off the tree, and it's provoking the culture and the society often. And finally, often at the point of extreme physical degradation and nearing death, they are visited by a spirit and given the power and information. So the power comes directly from the invisible world, from the spirit world. They're given that gift, if you like, though at the time they probably don't think it is a gift. Then they return to community and begin a formal training. And this pattern in various forms may last for many, many years. So it's not a short initiation. It's an initiatory crisis that can go on for, as we see here, this is a traditional Sage shaman from Siberia, and this is his wife speaking. How did he become a shaman? Sickness seized him when he was 23 years old, and he became a shaman at the age of 30. So 7 years that was how he became a shaman. After the sickness, after the torture, he had been ill for 7 years. While he was ailing, he had dreams. He was beaten up several times. Sometimes he was taken to strange places. So this, even in a culture that recognizes this is a legitimate path to becoming a wounded, what we would call in the modern terms, a wounded healer, they still see it as torture. Now why might that be? And this got me thinking when I started writing my book. Why do we have to go through it like that? Why can't we just kind of sign up to a course and get your nice certificate at the end and be a healer, which is possible as well. And what I came to realize is this idea of experience and an animistic reality. Now, shamanism is built on this animism, this idea that everything has a spirit to it. Everything is alive. So you have a spirit, but this building has a spirit to it. This floor has a spirit to it. An animal has a spirit. Even in so-called inanimate items, like a tree, has a spirit to it. But also more abstract and invisible forces. So an idea has a spirit to it. Sickness has a spirit to it. Now, if you want to know the power of any kind of the spirit behind an idea, look how many people have sacrificed their lives in the Western world on behalf of an idea. The idea might be freedom. The idea might be England. The idea might be democracy, or it might be communism, or it might be capitalism. All these are powerful ideas, but they have a life force to them that can literally suck a whole people up and get them doing things that they probably wouldn't normally do, like killing people or going off to fight or whatever. That is the power. And I think in the Western world, we've lost that understanding of the animistic power of reality, and therefore we're constantly caught up in these swirls of ideas and these passions, because they have a spirit to them. They have a life force. And from an animistic perspective, they may be human created, but once they're human created, they take on a spirit of their own, and then they become this powerful force. And this includes sickness. So from a shamanistic perspective, all sickness is caused by these spirits, this interference of these spiritual entities. Now, they might be coming from another person in the forms of cursing, in the forms of jealousy or things like that, anger, or it may be coming from the environment itself. So everything you could ever imagine, from the most exalted part of what it is to be human or what it is to experience life, from this magical sunset or sunrise to a nuclear bomb, everything has a place in an animistic reality. So the minute you start opening up to that animistic reality, there's a danger of overwhelm. A complete danger. So we as humans, we naturally, the brain has suppressive mechanisms naturally built into us. And we start learning those from a very young age. When we come in, we're very much more open to the spirit world. And then we start developing something called the ego, what people have called the ego. And we start repressing, because we can't experience too much reality all at once. We'd never get anything done. We would just... And in our culture, which really worships hard work and getting things done, they don't like animistic reality. Experiencing too much of the spirit world is, well, we shut it off completely. So we have these natural repressive mechanisms. Culture is a repression. Society, because we can't all just act out ourselves in society. But also language. Language is a really important suppressive mechanism that humans have developed, because the minute you start labeling something, you're defining it, and you're also separating it. So if I see you as a separate person, I'm naming you as a woman or whatever your name is. I'm no longer you're not all part of me. You're defined by your name and who you are, or some people are defined by their job or whatever. So we're separating aspects of reality so we can, in order to be able to navigate through this vast web of consciousness that we're constantly in. You only have to take maybe a teacher plant to see actually what is going on and how much of the brain how much of reality we are suppressing. Or some of you might have had spontaneous experiences where you suddenly experience a feeling of unity or oneness, or how huge life is and magical. So we need these suppressive mechanisms. So this is the tribe I work with. This is up in the Sacred Mountain in Mexico. So the Radica, they have a pilgrimage every single year, like I say, I've just come on, where they deliberately subvert the power that language has. So before you go on that pilgrimage, they rename everything. So obviously they have words for the sky, for the rocks, for the sand, for the cars nowadays. They rename everything. For tobacco, for beer. And on that pilgrimage, you can only use the new names. And it also includes the people on the pilgrimage. They get a new name, a completely new name. Actually, you get two names. You get a sacred name, and then you get a name of the opposite sex. So on that pilgrimage, I was Veronica. I don't know, a better sacred name. I'm not going to repeat that. But for now, I was Veronica. So they're very playful with it. But what they're doing is, and then they eat a lot of peyote, which is like a psychedelic, psychoactive plant. What they're doing is they're deliberately breaking down reality on a regular basis, because they understand that language is a suppressive mechanism. So if we define things too much, and a few people have talked about, if we get really caught up in our belief systems, we're under their spell. We're caught up in the spirit, and that spirit ends up dominating us. So they unbreak this all the time on a regular basis. But they do that in a ritualized way. They do that where the whole community comes together and they understand. What if that was to happen spontaneously? It's terrifying. Trust me, I had experiences when I was younger. I'd be walking along the street and I would see myself and experience myself climbing the walls at the same time and trying to be in two places. And obviously, walking down London streets, it's quite disturbing to have these experiences, or jumping off of buildings and not being able to separate between the realities. It's terrifying. The suppressive mechanisms are broken down. This is why people, when they have a very exalted spiritual experience, they really struggle putting it into words. I can't explain what happened. I can't describe it. That feeling of God or whatever, or unity. And likewise, when people, loss of the use of language is a diagnostic criteria in a lot of mental illnesses, including psychosis, schizophrenia, some of the manias. So this loss of the ability of language. Also, when people go through their mental health crises, they often, I can't put it into words. What's happening to me? I've lost myself. All of these things. Now, what I would suggest is what is happening is the normal suppressive mechanisms that filter out all of this information, filter out an animistic reality, are being experienced all at once. Now, depending on your character and your temperament is how you might respond to that. So some people might try to shut down completely and really put up the walls, and now you might sink into the mire of depression. And there's a lot of studying now that suggests that depression is a response to an overactive nervous system, a fear response. So it's actually, the nervous system is too stimulated, and that people use it, depression is a survival mechanism to shut down. You might respond to this reality as I did, with a lot of fear and terror, kind of walking around in terror all the time. Again, this overly stimulated nervous system is at play. Or you might get carried away and start seeing links everywhere and start seeing meaning in everything. Suddenly you're experiencing animistic reality. Now, a lot of you might have experienced that when you discover there's more to be going on in the kind of society than what the mainstream has told us. And then suddenly you're seeing links everywhere. And sometimes that can send people on such a, where they lose all contact with reality in themselves, and you have a psychotic break. So how you respond, or you might try and control reality with addictions, or things like eating disorders, or cutting oneself. It's all about controlling reality. I would suggest by cutting yourself, you're actually trying to feel something, and you're trying to release this energy. You're releasing this because there's so much energy that you're experiencing. So this is what I come to kind of understand, that this is what shamanism can perhaps teach us about what we call mental illness. That actually these are normal states of being, and throughout tens of thousands of years, human beings have been called in this initiatory way. They've been called by going mad, basically. And also, and we're going to look at this in a different context. Madness is always culturally specific. So what we call madness, another culture might hold in great esteem. And we don't have very good relationship, A, with any emotional extremes, or certainly expressions of emotional extremes, and B, with these, what we've called altered states of reality. Altered states of reality we either trivialize through entertainment, we medicalize through drugs to stop the person having these visions, or we criminalize through making illegal medicines that actually invoke these ways of perceiving reality. So therefore, we have a very uneasy relationship with these altered states. That's why the anthropologists were horrified when they saw these shamanic rituals. They thought it was wild and barbaric, and these people, they're going crazy. And they called them crazy, you know. But this is a calling that human beings have gone through for tens of thousands of years. And this is what I would say that shamanism has to teach us. But the important thing is is they create a cultural container around it. So you'd think after going through all that shamanic sickness and that, you could have a bit of a break. But no, that's when the actual formal training begins. And it's very interesting that formal shamanic training actually mimics a lot of the symptoms of the shamanic sickness. So engaging in relentless and obsessive behaviors. So this could be dancing for 3 days solid, fasting, drumming for hours or days on end, or provoking convulsions and shaking. It was, for years, before I would go deep into a trance, I would have a mini fit. And that's how I stopped myself having fits in normal life, because I realized they were a gateway into a trance state. Disturbing normal waking sleeping cycles, so consuming large quantities of mind-altering substances, teacher plants, etc., being pushed to the limits of physical and psychological endurance, sweating, fasting, spending prolonged periods of time alone in nature, being buried alive, which is something I offer in the woods, which is obviously quite an extreme experience. Now, this is on people that not necessarily got a good hold on reality anyway, so it's very interesting that instead of trying to shut these symptoms down, which we might do from a Western perspective, the shamanic cultures go, no, this is a sign that you've been touched by the spirits. But what we'll do is we'll build some discipline around it. So we'll give you the ritual container, so therefore you can use those natural gifts that you have, but in a way that is a culturally endorsed position. So it's actually set at where the mentally ill in our culture are always at the bottom of society. They're seen as the dregs, whereas in their culture, those who have gone through a shamanic sickness and then trained are seen as great leaders often, and great spiritual teachers. Okay. So I'm going to change tact a little bit now. So look at the civilization, and I put civilization, I should put it in inverted commas really, for this treatment of the mentally ill. How have Western or modern life technological cultures dealt with the mentally ill? And it is a quite horrendous story if you look into the history of psychiatry and Western treatment of it. So in the Middle Ages, which is the first slide, because of the great religious fervour at the time, it was a traditional view that the mentally ill were possessed by the devil. But also there was this idea that not only are they possessed by the devil, but actually they're invoking it a little bit. So when it came to the witch trials, the mentally ill, so-called mentally ill, and remember, to be mentally ill just means often to not fit in to mainstream society. So throughout history, women who cheated on their husbands would be locked up often for being mentally ill. People who fell through the cracks, who didn't conform to what the general society is, they were all often lumped together in with the mentally ill. So this idea that they were deliberately invoking the devil, and then you'd go to a priest in order to get an exorcism, and that would be the majority treatment of the mentally ill. Then we got so-called civilized, the age of enlightenment, so-called enlightenment and rationality, and so the mentally weren't then seen as being possessed by the devil, but they were seen as losing that one thing that Western civilization has always worshipped, and at the pinnacle, and that's reason and rationality. So the mentally ill had lost that. So they need to regain their rationality and reason. And so they would be locked up in madhouses, they were called, and then later they became known as asylums. But this is one of the techniques. The whole idea was to shock the madness out of people. So this guy would be spun for about 10 hours solid, spun round and round and round until reason somehow magically would come back into it. They also would dunk them in freezing cold water, way before Wim Hof, but hold them down against their will. The whole thing was to shock them back into, and we can laugh at it a bit now, but actually through the 20th century, or we can look back in horror even, but through the 20th century, things haven't improved that actual much. So then we go into the 20th century, and we've got this basically this idea that began with the Greeks, and a lot of our traditions come from Greek culture, and particularly around medicine. And this idea in Greek culture, they still had the traditional view that the madness or mental illness was seen as a gift or an incursion from the spirit world, or a gift of the gods often. Plato writes about this. But at the same time, you had this split off with a more kind of rational type treatments, and the idea of the four humours, so a more bodily idea that it's actually something in the physical body that is out of balance. So the idea in the Greek times was the four humours that needed to get back into balance, and these were, you could see them in life everywhere. And the word melancholy, which is the traditional word for depression, is actually translates directly as black bile. So an excess of black bile was seen as causing depression or melancholy. Hysteria, which began the kind of study of psychoanalysis in the 19th century, actually translates as wandering womb. So they would say that the womb had become somehow dislodged and was wandering about the rest of the body and needed to be put back in its place. Hence its association mainly with women. And you could say, well, that's a very kind of patriarchal culture that is beginning with the Greeks. And we're already starting to see this as a kind of a problem. So this split, but it was fairly well integrated in Greek times. But as we go through Western history, it's basically got more and more separate. This idea that mental illness is somehow caused by a physical problem in the body, whether that's in the brain or whether that's in the physical body, or it's something more to do with an imbalance in our souls. So you have psychotherapy, which is psych, obviously means soul, so it's soul therapy. So you have that on one hand, and then the other split is you have this biochemical model, which I'll talk a bit more about in a minute. So this search for a physical cause of mental illness has caused so much treatment that has been really destructive, including ECT, electric convulsive therapy, which means obviously that's the classic from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Do people know that that's still going on now? And there's a lot of controversy around it now. And then one of the great one's transorbital lobotomy, where basically they would put an ice pick in, they would break the eye socket, put an ice pick in there and hammer it in, and then cut across the brain. And I mentioned this in my book. There's a historian who's done a lot of research, and he looked at the original proponents of this, Walter Freeman, and he went on a tour across America, which he nicknamed Operation Ice Pick. The good thing about this for them was that it was very quick. He actually won a Nobel Prize for medicine for this procedure. And there's because if they cut too much, then the person may die or may not come back with any faculties at all. But if they cut too little, they thought it's not going to work. So they would talk to the person as they're cutting through their brain. And in one of the transcripts, they said, this person said, the doctor said, what's on your mind? And the guy said, a knife, because that was what was literally passing through his mind. Now, I just want to read a kind of, I think this kind of sums up the kind of, this is a Walter Freeman quote, the idea, because it began as a treatment for depression, but then, of course, they moved it into schizophrenia, even though there was never any medical basis for any of this. And so Walter Freeman says, even if a patient is no longer able to paint pictures, write poetry, or compose music, he is, on the other hand, no longer ashamed to fetch and carry, to wait on tables and make beds or empty cans. And this kind of shows this idea that how the mental ill are seen. They're seen as a burden. They're seen as a distraction. And really they need to be... So take away the poetry, take away the creativity, but at least there'll be a nice conformist patient, if you like. Now, interestingly, one of the first antipsychotics, one of the main reasons that transorbital, the lobotomy died out, apart from a lot of controversy, was that they developed the pills, if you like. And one of the first antipsychotics, they marketed it at the time as a chemical lobotomy, because lobotomies were so popular, and it's still in use today. So this idea that the mentally ill, now what is driving a lot of this is, which I'm not going to have time to go into much detail on today, but it's a lot more detail in my book, was this idea of degeneration. So there's this concept in 19th century, 20th century Europe particularly, and the States, of evolution becomes the pinnacle, this worship of evolution. But what they couldn't understand, if we're the most evolved people on the planet, how come we still have this problem with the mentally ill? And so they invented this term called degeneration. So that as a lot of people evolve, some people degenerate, and they're the mentally ill. So the whole idea was that they're never going to have a purpose. They're never going to have a function in society. They're just the kind of the offcuts of society, if you like. So we either need to cut out their sickness, or we need to make sure they don't breed, and sterilization happened a lot between the wars. Mentally ill people were forcibly sterilized. So the idea was they won't pass on anything that is wrong with them. And this happened a lot in the States. Obviously, after the Second World War and the horrors of the Holocaust, that become a bit of an unpopular option, this sterilization, because that happened there as well. So this idea that the mentally ill are best at these kind of degenerates, they're falling down. There's no meaning behind mental illness. There's no purpose behind it other than something that is needed to be fixed. And this continues today. Now, it's all kicked off this week. I couldn't be doing this talk at a better time, because I want to briefly talk about the serotonin, the brain imbalance, chemical imbalance theory. Most of you probably heard about serotonin, a lack of serotonin causing depression. As this study says, 85 to 95% of public believe that low serotonin or chemical imbalances causes depression. Guess what? There's zero evidence of that. It's a theory that was arrived at where they used the antidepressants first, and this is true for every psychiatric medicine. They invent it normally for another procedure. So the chloroboprazine, which I can't pronounce, which is the antipsychotic I mentioned, was originally an anesthetic for surgery. And they noticed it knocked people out so much. They think, well, we'll use this on people psychotic or schizophrenics. And similar with the antidepressants and the tranquilizers, etc. So they arrived at this study, this hypothesis, and yet it's never been proven. And so there was this huge, and there's been a big campaign for a long time. There was a group of mental health survivors in 2003 went on hunger strike, demanding the American Psychiatric Association show them one piece of evidence that proves the brain chemical imbalance theory. And of course they couldn't, the American. There's not one piece of evidence that proves that theory. It's a theory, it's a hypothesis. But the thing is, this theory is so in mainstream society, and it's so repeated by doctors even, because they've been sold the lie as well. But this week, a comprehensive, well-powered, high-quality review now determines this theory is not empirically substantiated. That was literally this week. It's a meta analysis of all the different experiments or studies that have tried to prove this theory, and they've shown categorically that it just doesn't exist in terms of science. The simple way, if a doctor says to you, you have a brain imbalance or the lack of serotonin, ask them, what's the ideal serotonin level? No one knows. They can't even measure it very well, because most studies, they have to do a really invasive lumbar puncture to take out the cerebral spinal fluid. And so they've only done a few of these, but again, it's been inconclusive. And dopamine and psychosis is very similar as well. So this brain chemical imbalance, why did it come in so much? And really, we've got to look at the DSM, which is this kind of psychiatric Bible. This over-diagnosis, this explosion in diagnosis. Now there's hundreds and different. Even when I started out being mentally ill, there was still only a few diagnoses. Now there's hundreds and hundreds. Now, an example of this might be the unholy ties to the pharmaceutical industry, when Beecham's wanted to get into their antidepressant into the highly lucrative anxiety market. So what they did is their marketing teams invented these patient advocacy groups, so-called patient advocacy. They were completely invented, and they got them campaigning, and then they flooded the media with this idea of social anxiety. It's all the details of it in my book. Social anxiety had never been heard of, and then suddenly within a couple months the whole of America's talking about this phenomenon of social anxiety, and then lo and behold, Beecham has a antidepressant that actually fixes social anxiety, and their profits went through the roof. This is all in kind of public record now. They've been fined millions and billions for these false practices. So where is the power? The other thing they found out, that the difference between drug and placebo has always been overhyped. So actually, again, I think last month they did a meta-analysis comparing not just the press releases that the drug companies release with the drugs, but the studies. And they stated the difference between placebo and drugs is 0.36%. And between psychotherapies and placebo, 0.34%. The placebo, probably the most powerful drug Western medicine has ever invented, which also has the opposite idea, the nocebo. And this would align in a lot in shamanic cultures to cursing. This idea, and particularly doctors have a lot of power. So this idea that you have to be on this medication for life, otherwise you will get depression again, or you will go on into psychosis. This has been repeated again and again, even though there's no science behind it. So this power to heal or to curse has always been tradition in the shaman's hands, and they were the medical professionals of the day. And what they've done is they've utilized this idea of the placebo to a really powerful level. So if you go to a traditional shaman and you say, I'm sick, they'll look you down, probably shake their head a few times, and then they'll get their feathers, do some magic, and then they'll suck a stone out of you. Or they will suck a piece of glass. They will go in to where the sickness is, and they will suck out this stone, this object, this claw, it could be, and they'll show it to you. Now, when anthropologists first saw this, they said, oh, they're all fakes, they're all conjurers. Now, I don't know, because the guys I work with, I've watched them suck 60 stones out of people, working with 60 people. Now, you can hide a few stones on your being, but where are you going to hide 60? And just watch them, and I'm watching them like a hawk. I'm always trying to see, are they tricking me? I don't know. The jury's out. But what it does show is that we as human beings have this huge power in our mind to be well or to be sick, to embrace life. But we need help with that. We need help with that. We need to be shown something physical. And this is where shamans have traditionally used, if it is a placebo, they use the power of the individual because it also empowers them. Now, there's a lot of placebo studies now that show that even when a person knows they're taking a placebo, it's a sugar pill, it still works. Because that very action of just putting a pill in your mouth, we're so conditioned. That's our story, that's our spell and our culture. You get sick, you take a drug, you get better. That is the spell. So you don't even have to buy into it that much because it's there in the psychic environment. So let's look quickly at, got a few minutes, the promise of psychedelic medicine. So psychedelics, some of you have probably heard of, because if we're looking at shamanic ways of treating mental illness, these plant beings, in a lot of cultures, the plants, the teacher plants, they're seen as the original shamans. So any shaman who comes afterwards in a human form is kind of a bit lesser to the plants, if you like. The plant has all the power. This is a liberty cap, which we're blessed in these lands. And let's look at a few clinical trials for this depression. Because depression is a very modern disease, and it's a very particularly Western disease. The guys I work with, they don't have depression. They don't even understand it. They have no concept of it. They don't have much concept of psychosis, to be honest, because what they say is if that happens to someone, they just tie them to a tree, wait so they don't harm it themselves or anyone else, and then they wait till it wears off, and then the next day they're normal. But I was with a Murakami once, and he said, if you want to be a Murakami, you've got to go through that, when people have to lose it completely. There's something about losing our consensual reality in order, because shamans manage the spirits of sickness, so they have to understand what makes people sick. And in their cultures, the mind is seen as so powerful in terms of creating heaven, if you like, or hell, how powerful our minds are. So depression, 3 decades ago, the average onset of depression was 30. Today it's 14, the average age. At this pace, over 50% of our younger generation, aged 18 to 29, will succumb to it by the middle age. And going one generation further, they're saying we will all have depression, basically. So psilocybin. Psilocybin is the active ingredient in what we call traditionally, colloquially, magic mushrooms. So those of you who like to go and pick these, what time of year do they come out? Autumn. Yeah. So basically they come out when we're going into virtually 6 months of darkness. We don't really see the sun a lot in the UK over those 6 months. We might see it. So we're going into that darkness. So if you would look at this medicine, you could think, oh, maybe they've got something to teach us about when we go into that darkness, about keeping light, about not succumbing to the depression, which can naturally enfold humans and societies that live in kind of the more northern regions. So there's an idea. They also grow on highly cultivated fields, like fields that have been wiped out of biodiversity by sheep, horses sometimes. They grow on the dead grass. So again, they're a reminder that if we take too much from the earth without giving back, they remind us that we're all interconnected. So this study, anyway, clinically resistant depression trial, it was given to 20 patients, all tried at least 2 treatments without success. They'd suffered depression from average time of 18 years. Basically, all patients showed some reduction in their depression scores at 1 week post-treatment, and maximal effects were seen at 5 weeks, which 47% of participants shown a response, with these results remaining positive at 3 and 6 months. Now, with this, it's 1 dose. They're not on a medication for life. They take 1 and occasionally 2 doses with a bit of follow-up therapy to integrate, but not much. Now, I love this. Notably, reductions in depressive symptoms at 5 weeks were predicated by the quality of the acute psychedelic experience, specifically the mystical experience questionnaire. So they have to fill in this questionnaire afterwards of how mystical their experience was, which is great. I can just imagine some of the questions. Did you suffer complete ego loss, half ego loss? Did you see angels? Did you see a lower class of entities? I mean, but basically people that scored higher who had these ego-dissolving experiences, these feelings of universal unity, oneness, this feeling that nature, these animistic experiences of life, that nature is alive, that these mushrooms have an extraordinary intelligence and they actually want to help human beings. Those are the ones that had... So what it's emphasizing, it's not the substance, it's the experience. So this, I think, is really interesting because, and this through personal experience. So they've done a few of these now, a psilocybin with terminal illness, so people diagnosed with terminal cancer. And obviously that creates a lot of depression, anxiety, fear, etc. Thank you. And that's something you can't move on from. It's not something you can get over with a little bit of therapy. And these had extraordinary results. So up to 70% reported the experience was either the single most or in the top 5 meaningful experiences in their lifetime. 90% said that it proved life satisfaction. 80% were still showing these benefits 7 months later. And the initial study presented findings that psilocybin produces substantial and sustained decreases in depression and anxiety in patients with life-threatening cancer, which I think is extraordinary. So these people are facing death, and then they did a recent follow-up, and it kept going 4.5 years later. One experience. That is the magic and the power, potential power of this medicines, which is extraordinary. Because these people are facing death. They're facing, and I think most what we call mental illness is an experience of death, what we might call ego death, a loss of a sense of self. And that's what causes it so much pain. But instead of trying to suppress those symptoms, as modern medicine has often tried to do, or try and analyze them, or try and get you over them, what shamanistic view does is it says, okay, these experiences of life, and actually those that are more sensitive to life, are the ones, and when we're on the, as Andy was saying, and I'm going to finish here, that the planet is dying. We're seeing that in insects. We've taken so much from the earth without giving back. Indigenous people are responsible for, I think, 4% of the total landmass of the earth, and they're responsible for 80% of its biodiversity. Because the shamans are constantly negotiating with the spirits of nature. So when nature is sick, it will fight back. And at one point, it might say, humans, you're getting everything out of balance now. So the nature is sick, the earth, and those most sensitive are going to be the ones feeling it the most. And shamans are traditionally seen as overly sensitive to life. They feel too much. And mentally ill people, I would say, are the same. They feel too much life. And therefore, they're the ones that we label mentally ill and that we try and medicate, or we try and say, just get rid of. But actually, they might have a really important message as potential wounded healers to actually what is going on in the planet right now. So we're locking up our prophets, our seers, we're kind of degrading them. Whereas actually, and that's not a romantic view, it's a practical view, that those who understand sickness are much more likely to be able to help others. Thank you.